Hello, friends. Welcome back to episode 2 of Tissue Talks. We are back here today. I am Max. I'm with my boy,
Diego.
Welcome to the new setup. As you guys can see clearly, we have a different thing going on here. So we're actually filming remotely. We each have the microphones in our own cribs. We're using cameras and stuff. So we're
Sponsored by Shure. Thank you, Shure.
Yeah, thanks, Shure. They covered all the costs for this video. They saw some two up-and-comers, just a lot of promise, a lot of just,
we're making it out of Max's living room for sure.
Just out the mud. And we just spent about like an hour doing this, but it's a good setup.
Oh, it was bad. It was like my headphones weren't working, and then the microphone wasn't working, and then Max muted his microphone. We thought something was wrong, but
yeah,
what matters is that we found the optimal lighting to display the tissue and to display our credentials right here. So,
right.
What else do you need?
That's kind of the foundation. That's what most of this is all about,
Truly, yeah.
We're using an interesting platform to kind of have both of our local videos and audios posted up. So hopefully everything sounds good. As mentioned before, this will most likely be the first episode that we put onto the audio app. So if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify Podcasts, thanks for checking in. Before we get into this on everything, guys, make sure you're following, you're subscribing to all this stuff, smash the like button, all that good stuff. We do appreciate all your support on this. We also really appreciate your feedback on last episode. A lot of you guys checked in. A lot of you guys sent us some really lovely DMs and messages and just good feedback overall. So I think we learned a lot from the first podcast. We are, and we're going to move forward with a lot of the similar, but some things different, and kind of just, it's going to evolve as we go naturally. So one of the things I think we did a really good job of last time was just trying to keep things moving while also having some level of depth on each topic. I think moving forward, we're going to try to keep things based on what some people had said, just a little bit more digestible per se, just in terms of keep the language a little bit more casual when talking about scientific stuff. We definitely want to make sure to have a evidence-based take on most of the things we talk about. So it's important for us to make claims that are relatively based on science and our experience combined, but we don't want to crowd you guys out in the sense that using too much esoteric language that's a little bit hard to understand. So you can go ahead.
Yeah, it's tough when you are putting yourself out on the internet to not want to just back up every single claim that you make for the fear that someone's going to come in and say, well, I read a study that said the complete like that's bound to happen at some point. So I think we just kind of went off the deep end of let's keep this scientifically rigorous. And I think that was at the expense of just really what a podcast should kind of be about to make it enjoyable for you guys, which is just, shooting the stuff, because it's too early in the podcast for me to swear, but that'll happen later.
Exactly. No, yeah, I think Diego nailed it there. So we actually didn't even talk about this in the first podcast. We were going to literally go into the name of Tissue Talks, and then I was nervous and just diverted the entire thing to getting into like topic 1 or whatever.
We were just like, Q&A, throw it on there.
Nervous. So we could talk about Tissue Talks. Honestly, this is something I've been saying for a while in the gym. Think about when just some big guy walks in and you're just, example A right here for those who are watching on video, Diego's flexing, looking just absolutely criminal. Someone just walks in and like just how someone carrying muscle, like it speaks for itself. So when someone says tissue talks, it means, you don't have to ask if this person's jacked. The tissue talks. It speaks for itself. It's really something, it's an independent speaker per se, so you can't get around it.
Yeah, it's just objective. It's the closest thing we have to objective. Like when somebody asks you what your credentials are, you say, how much do you bench? Like that's really what the bottom line should be. MD, right. PhD, who cares about that? How much do you bench? That's the only
or how big are your shoulders? What's the tissue looking like?
What's the not physique? The shoulders?
Show us the physique,
Yeah, truly.
So it's really legs. Just I think, if you just see someone with a mean set of quads, they've endured some hard sets for a long time on the leg press or any type of squatting motion. So I agree with that. That's actually really true. You can't really call yourself a lifter if your legs aren't busting out of most jeans that you would buy at the store.
Mm-hmm. If you don't have to wear like 2 times the size of jeans that would fit your waist, then you got to start squatting more. Based on our last episode, you don't necessarily need to squat. You can do machine movements and get even better hypertrophy potentially. So
yes, we could even do a quick recap of last episode, is there anything you want to specifically, just like quickly, it's not spend a long time on it, but just like a
Hmm.
quick thing that you might want to reframe or upon reviewing the podcast, maybe that you would change if you were to re-say anything? Because I have like one or two things I would want to do, but we don't want to harp on this for too long if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think looking back at it, a lot of what we said wasn't wrong. I think a lot of what we said was actually pretty applicable to most people. But obviously, there's like some nuances here and there that maybe we could have discussed a little bit more, specifically going into peri workout nutrition and kind of like BCAAs and the whole like drama surrounding BCAAs, I guess. BCAAs have been found to be effective for um, enhancing muscle protein synthesis after a workout. But where kind of the narrative of BCAAs are mostly useless come in is the fact that if you're eating enough protein, it doesn't really matter if you're taking BCAAs or not, as long as you're kind of hitting your protein targets. And I kind of don't want to like put it out there that like, well, this is going to be like harmful to you or this should be something that you should avoid. Like if you like sipping something during your workout and you want to buy BCAAs and use them, that's okay. But we're kind of like as coaches and also just as people who lift, like we understand like you don't want to be spending extra money on stuff that you don't necessarily need when you can be allocating it to stuff that could be much more useful and effective in enhancing your performance. Because what's the point of just buying, throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks when you can just kind of go by what tried and true methods have shown to be useful, which is, what science is useful for, to just kind of
Yeah.
be able to tease out like what on average seems to help the most amount of people.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think for context, the BCAAs, as we spoke to in the last episode, is basically, as Diego said, it's just branch chain amino acids. So it's a part of a protein. We know we need protein to build muscle. So people take protein supplements in the effort of building muscle because it is the building blocks of muscle. So for people who are just looking to find a supplement, it's just, you just cover your bases if you're having enough protein through your diet, or if you just have a good whey protein source. I actually talked about this yesterday in my sport nutrition class. We spoke about BCAAs and just supplements in general. And kind of if you think about the hierarchy, it's going to be protein powders first, EAAs second, and then BCAAs last. It's like a Russian doll, if you were to imagine an analogy. The whey has it all. The EAAs, it's going to have EAAs and other things in it that are kind of just more complete, and then
Mm-hmm.
the BCA is just part of the EAAs. So if you have the opportunity to get whey or just any complete animal protein, you're covering most of your bases. So I think that's a really good point to make. Um, but I would also say one thing I wanted to comment on the last episode, we just talked about SBD for hypertrophy. I think we got to a really good point towards the end of it a little bit, talking about how not all compounds are created equal. So in terms of squat, bench, and deadlift, we don't have to harp on this too long, but we were kind of talking around the point that those vessels, those specific exercises may not be the most efficient for minimizing fatigue and maximizing stimulus as a compound. So there's just other compounds that I think are better for muscle growth. And that doesn't mean that they're not good for muscle growth. I just think that with just so much plethora of like machines and general equipment you'll see in a normal gym, it's like, well, why am I not going to do some volume at least in my leg press? If you're really just trying to maximize muscle growth, it's probably best to stick to machines, cables, dumbbells. In my opinion, I think barbells absolutely have a role, and you can 100% get jacked in a room that's just barbells and dumbbells. But if you're someone who's taking it seriously and you want to minimize fatigue to the best of your ability, yes, you can do a barbell back squat slow with a pause. That's absolutely true, but you just get things like spinal erector fatigue and your body just gets tired in other ways that aren't always specific to the legs. And same goes for the deadlift, as we talked about briefly last episode. Just like there's not really one or two muscle groups that are being hit by the deadlift. It's kind of a shotgun exercise, right? So once again, compounds are great, but just doesn't really do an efficient job of keeping things specific enough. So I just kind of want to touch on that a little bit because I think we did a good job towards the end of it talking about that, but just we lost a little bit towards the middle. But yeah, that's kind of what I'd say about that too.
And a lot of this is going to apply more to more advanced lifters. So for people who are just getting started in the gym or have been spending like maybe 1 or 2 years in the gym, like you can still do mostly compounds and make great progress. But once you get more to the advanced stage and you start requiring higher volumes of training to be able to elicit the same hypertrophy or maybe even less hypertrophy than you were eliciting when you were a beginner, you might have to look for variations that are less fatiguing. Because, I mean, a beginner can go into the gym and squat one plate for sets of 5 and do like 4 sets and be fine, you know. But if someone who squats 500 pounds wants to do 5 sets of 10 with 500 pounds or something like that, by that 5th set, that's going to be a lot of joint fatigue. Knees are going to start to hurt, back is going to start to hurt. So it really just depends. I heard that siren in the background. I think they're
I
calling
just
for you,
muted
Max.
it. I can't even really
Yep.
hear it because I have my AirPods in and they're noise canceling. But I'm like, I
No,
live
but
near
the city
Gramercy
needs
in
you
Union
though. The city
Square.
needs you.
Yeah, it's crazy. I honestly don't really hear too much from my apartment, but sometimes I'll hear just something. I don't know. It's crazy. If
Yeah.
you think about being in the city, like I feel like all around me, there's just low key crime documentaries happening that I just don't understand or I'm not aware of. Definitely biased. If you see like crime TV, then you walk around New York, you're like, oh my God, where's the underground drug cartel? It's like hard to say, but anyway, that's a digression.
You like walk into the wrong alleyway, and then you're like, oh, dude, I'm gonna be on live. I'm gonna be
Where's
featured on Live
Daredevil?
Leak.
Yeah. Where are they? God damn it. Where's the Penguin? He's here. I know
Literally.
it.
By the way, The Penguin, great show. If you haven't watched it yet, if you like the Batman, The Penguin is really good. Definitely
It is
recommend
really
it.
good. Colin Farrell's great. I think I've heard some people say the acting from other actors isn't great, but I kind of disagree. I think they all do a really good job of tying it in. I think like there's
100%.
6. We're on episode 6 right now. I don't know if you're fully caught up, but there's 8.
Oh,
I guess
I'm
supposedly
episode
coming
3.
out.
No spoilers. No
Oh
spoilers.
damn, you got to catch up for real.
I know.
That's
I just wanted to throw
crazy.
that out there. You know, apart from fitness content, we also have to provide culture to you guys.
Correct. Yes, this is a culture podcast exclusively, not iron culture. Nothing to do with that.
Not to be confused with iron culture.
I know you guys were thinking that because I'm sure maybe 1% of you are aware of that as well. But anyway, I think we should get into one of the first topics that we want to talk about today. And we'll start with your topic. I think that if you're down, we'll talk about kind of what we want to get started with physical activity. So talking about health benefits. I guess we could start off by defining physical activity and then kind of go into what you think are the pros, cons, and how to apply it to the average person just in general. And what is physical activity? How is it useful to the average person?
Mm-hmm. So physical activity, I think, can be kind of a nebulous term because, I mean, especially coming from a medicine background currently, you'll hear a lot of medical practitioners be like, well, this patient has like high cholesterol, high blood pressure, not very good glucose regulation. They should do more physical activity. And then the patient's just kind of like what does that mean? So I think it's good to, like you said, start by defining what physical activity is. And to put it simply, it's any type of activity that isn't already kind of your just daily tasks. Yes, some of your daily tasks are going to include some physical activity. Like if you're working a manual job and you have to be carrying around stuff all day and you're like walking a bunch of steps, like that's going to be physical activity, but I think physical activity should be to some extent allocated mostly to you actively trying to exercise. Are you going out of your way to move your body in a way that isn't just your daily routine? So physical activity can be anything from resistance training 5 times per week, or it can be just going on a leisurely walk once per day, but it's you actively like trying to move your body throughout the day.
Okay, cool. So yeah, I think it's interesting. I've heard different definitions of physical activity, especially coming from a kinesiology background. The way we defined it in class was a little bit different. If we kind of look at like overall expenditure of the human body, which is an important topic to speak on, and we might actually put a little diagram up here if I remember to. I'll put something up quickly in post, just or maybe not. But if I do, then we're really in our bag. But just understanding how a human being uses energy and where calories are burned on a day-to-day basis. Physical
Okay, so you want to go
activity.
into that.
Yeah, so maybe talking a
Let's
little
do
bit
it.
more from like a NEAT versus EAT versus TEF versus
Okay, sweet.
BMR. That could be an interesting application of physical activity. Maybe I'll quickly go through that. So just to kind of get an idea, I think there's a really big misunderstanding in the general public of where people burn their calories from, right? Especially in people who are listening to this who might have efforts of fat loss, one of the first things that people might think to do is like hop on a treadmill or start to increase their cardio or do things that are outside of just scoping out a little bit and looking at their overall day as a whole. So understanding how the human body burns energy will tie into the physical activity conversation here in just a second. But I think it's important to kind of tie it in if we start with this. So roughly about 75%, yes, three quarters of the energy you spend just to exist and live come down to something called your BMR, or your basal metabolic rate. So this is just how much energy you're going to burn if you're in a coma laying down. Your brain is using it, your internal organs to function, respiratory system, cardiovascular system, just to keep the vessel alive, keep the flesh vessel moving. Not even moving, but just like, sedentary and
Not being
existing per
dead.
se.
Just
Yeah,
not
just
being
like
dead.
literally not being dead. Exactly. So already, I think a lot of people have a preconceived notion that they have to burn the majority of the food that they intake in order to get into a deficit, right? Like, let's say you're, eating 2,500 calories a day and you're trying to get into a 500 calorie deficit or whatever, but you just feel like you need to kind of do over 500 calories of cardio. You got to do a lot of activity. It doesn't take into consideration your BMR is already going to be using roughly 70 to 75% of the energy you intake already. That's your brain. That's all the things we just talked about before. So keep in mind, like, you need food just to exist, obviously, right? So that's just one key component of it. There's a few other subsections that don't make up as big, but the remaining quarter of energy expenditure will fluctuate person to person depending on how active they are. But the one that you're thinking about doing when you're going to the gym is exercise activity thermogenesis, EAT. So how much energy do you burn during exercise? And the way that exercise is defined formally in exercise science is any formal planned type of movement or just way of challenging your body via an external stimulus, and whether that's lifting weights or doing traditional cardio, how you might think of it, or a dance class, or just anything where you're going out and intentionally trying to drive up further physical activity. So kind of tying back into what we were talking about before, that's going to be the biggest difference between exercise and physical activity. Is exercise is planned, it's something that you're going into with the it's just you're doing it intentionally. Whereas physical activity, largely understood, is something that you're kind of just twiddling your thumbs or walking around, or lifting the groceries or hugging your family members or whatever it looks like, making the bed, things that are a little bit more generally less planned, just going to happen anyway if you don't include it into exercise. So we separate the exercise into planned. What is the unplanned? It's called physical activity, but it's also known as non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which is just a fancy word for what you're doing outside of being alive and exercising. So this is what I just defined previously. It's the lifting the groceries, it's the twiddling your thumbs, it's the playing the Xbox controller, it's the bouncing your knee up and down when you're sitting in your chair and you're restless and your body needs to expend more than just the resting amount. So we have BMR, which is just at rest, what you burn, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which can make up, depending how active you are, we'll talk about this briefly too, how we can expand upon it, maybe
Hmm.
anywhere from like 15 to 25, 30% of your daily expenditure. It could be, somewhere a little bit on average, probably on the lower end for most people. We have the exercise activity thermogenesis, which is your planned cardio and your planned resistance training. And then the final one, just to touch on, is your thermic effect of food. So that's known as TEF, which is basically how much energy does your body need to spend to digest the food you're consuming. And that makes up roughly 5 to 10% of your daily expenditure. So zooming out a little bit, just pause and think about conceiving expenditure and how you're burning calories, how you're using your food for energy on a day-to-day basis. Doesn't come just down to exercise activity thermogenesis, but we tie in, and if we can equate non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or just NEAT, to physical activity, now we can look at another vector other than just my workout compared to existing. What else can I do to burn calories? How else can I increase my expenditure? So I just wanted to add that as kind of like a base understanding for the audience.
Hmm.
And then if you want to continue on, and because I know you had stuff to speak on, just in terms of physical activity.
So that was a great explanation of kind of like the different subsects of your energy expenditure, and kind of like where that energy is going when you eat, obviously, because all of those calories that you're consuming are being put towards those different kind of allocations that Max was talking about. So the reason I was kind of focusing on the planned exercise is because, kind of how Max explained, BMR, NEAT, and thermic effective feeding are mostly not controlled by you. So you can't really influence them a ton. BMR specifically, BMR, like, that's basically like what your body needs calorically to actually be able to do the many chemical processes that you need to actually like survive. You know, that you need to be able to grow hair, that you need to be able to like shed skin and like grow new skin day to day. It's like, it's stuff that you can't really regulate, and that won't really be upregulated or downregulating unless you're like in starvation mode and your body starts like kind of shutting things down. You know, NEAT, however, is a lot more reactive than it is proactive. So your body regulates NEAT a lot based on what your caloric intake is. So, for example, you can give a bunch of people, let's say like 100 people, you can give them 3,000 calories, right? And some people, let's say, for example, that their BMRs are all the same. You give them 3,000 calories, some people are going to gain weight, some people are going to lose weight, and some people are going to maintain weight. And that's mostly because the non-exercise activity thermogenesis level of people tend to be a little bit different. You know, some people tend to on average be more fidgety, some people tend to just be more sedentary, and the same can be the case when the same people are eating different caloric energy levels. So for example, if somebody's in a deficit, they might not have as high of NEAT because they have to conserve some of that energy. So they might fidget around less. If somebody's in an energy surplus, which just means you're eating more than you need, then you might see higher NEAT because your body just has calories to burn, you know? So the reason why I kind of focused on, and thermic effective feeding, though mostly you can't influence it, you can to some extent by eating potentially higher protein and higher fiber, but it's like really negligible amounts. You know, it's nothing that'll actually make any sort of impact if you're trying to lose weight, for example, or not, like it shouldn't be the primary vector of you trying to lose weight. So, among those four kind of allocations of energy, exercise activity thermogenesis really is the one that you can have the most influence over. And therefore, I kind of like to focus a lot of my efforts towards, you know, building habits that are conducive towards higher levels of activity in the exercise realm. What do you think about that,
Yeah,
Max?
I think that's great. I think it's a really good delineation. I would also add that the few things that you can do to influence like things like your BMR, one of the ones you'll hear is increase your muscle mass. So that'll be something you can do is just if you add muscle, there's been a lot of, in my opinion, overinflation of the hype of building muscle's influence on resting calorie expenditure. I think it's so interesting in fitness. You just hear people like, well, how can I burn more calories? How can I burn more? It's like such a focus for so many people. And like, I get it. You want to get into a calorie deficit, you want to lose fat. It's important to make sure you're burning calories. But exercise isn't just about burning calories. And muscle on your body, while it may burn a little bit more, I think I you can't quote me on this, but I think it's like 4 calories per pound, or like maybe 3 to 5 calories per additional pound of muscle mass. Might be a little bit more than that. I'll have to double check those numbers, but I don't think it's more than like 10, maybe 15 calories, like at the top end. For some reason, the number is a little bit lower in my head. Um, but just understand, like, if you have a pound of muscle you're adding, let's say you're a beginner in the gym, like if you could add like 15 pounds of muscle in like a year and a half from just a complete newbie, that's like maybe an additional, at most like 100 to 150 calories at rest. Like that'd be really generous in my opinion. It's probably more like 70 to 100. So
I want to
BMR,
pause there real quick.
go
If you
ahead.
see
Yep.
me, like exiting the screen, it's because I have to burp, and I don't want to burp straight into the mic. I hope the mic's
Tap the
not picking
mute
that up.
button, dog. You got a mute button. That's
In
hilarious.
my head, it's easier to just like go like this instead of
Bro just
actually.
hitting the wave. He's just moving like crazy.
Ooh, that's what I love you.
If you're not watching the video, you're missing out on that. But
Yeah, I'm cranking that
um,
Soldier Boy right now.
oh, it's just so good. So just understand BMR, right? We talked about it. It's like 75% of your expenditure. Muscle mass, I would say, is the primary one. Um, I think the major distinction between my understanding of this topic and probably yours is how we would classify steps, either as NEAT or exercise. So
Mm.
I have a feeling that this discussion is going to talk a little bit about things you can directly influence to get your expenditure up. That's not, or maybe it is, like we will talk about the cardio and resistance training, but like steps, do you put that into NEAT or EAT, and why? I'll give that to you.
I think it depends on the context. So, for example, if let's say you get 10,000 steps and that is included in your daily life, like you have to take 10,000 steps to commute to work and come back, I would probably say that's neat. But if you deliberately go on a walk to get 5,000 steps, it's probably closer to exercise. However, does it really matter? No, it's like part of what we're going to talk about in terms of changes that you can make to your life in order to increase your physical activity. So for the sake of the podcast, to just like talk about physical activity as like things that you can influence and things that you can kind of plan and incorporate into your life, then I'm probably going to put it more towards exercise activity. But it could very well, like you can make the case that it's non-exercise activity as well, and I'm not going to like argue for it because it can very much be both.
Cool. All right,
What do
so
you
you want
think?
to go ahead and talk about? Yeah, I've classically heard it defined more so as NEAT, but I do think like if it is planned, then of course, as I just earlier defined, like then it's technically exercise.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you're qualifying exercise as being in a certain intensity range. But as you alluded to, we're talking about expenditure as a whole, so it doesn't really matter for the impacts of the podcast. So why don't we go take that next step and kind of talk a little bit more about how you can perceive physical activity versus kind of exercise and maybe the health benefits, or how much does the viewer, you listening, how much do you need to be doing of physical activity or exercise to optimize your health?
Mm-hmm. So, my idea to talk about this came from a couple of studies that recently came out that detail basically the benefits that you get from physical activity in your day to day, so daily physical activity, and how they correlate with the amount of activity that you're doing and the intensity of activity that you're doing. So, really, when you break it down, right, it seems like the volume of activity that you do, so basically how much, not necessarily exercise, but how much you're moving around in a day, tends to benefit your health more than the intensity of the exercise that you're doing. So you see the greatest benefit in reductions to all cause mortality. And you're going to hear me say that a lot because a lot of these kind of epidemiological studies on kind of the benefits of certain treatments or the benefit of certain activities, a lot of them work by risk reduction. So they work on basically what are the chances that somebody's going to develop cardiovascular disease, or what are the chances that somebody's going to develop colorectal cancer. Like they basically calculate that in these epidemiological studies as like reductions to risk. So they basically take a group, right, that didn't do a lot of physical activity and see which of these people developed this disease or had this clinical outcome, and then they check another group that had a higher level of physical activity and they check, well, what were their chances, and they compare. So there seems to be the highest reduction in risk of all cause mortality, which basically just means a bunch of different ways that you can die, whether it's disease related or just, getting hit by a bus or something like that. And that the biggest change seems to be from 0, so fully sedentary, to 5,000 steps per day, which isn't a lot. Like 5,000 steps, most of you get 5,000 steps without even giving it a second thought. That's just kind of what you need to like walk around in your day. So from there, from 5,000 to 10,000 steps, you get further reduction. And then from 10,000 steps onwards, it's like a very minimal reduction. Because, like, if you're getting like 15,000 steps, you're a very active person. That's taking a lot of your daily time to like walk around that much. So when you think about it as just purely the volume of exercise that you're doing, then you can kind of conceptualize exercise, or I guess like activity thermogen or non-activity thermogenesis or exercise thermogenesis, as just how much time you're not lounging or how much time you're just not sitting on your ass and doing nothing. So that seems to be a better predictor of your health outcomes than the intensity of your exercise. So if you're jogging or you're running or you're sprinting or you're just walking, it doesn't really matter that much. Unless, however, you're trying to like train for a marathon or something, or you're trying to become very cardiovascularly proficient or adapted, then in that case, then running or doing a more aerobic task is probably going to be more conducive towards that goal. But for just general health, walking around is really all you need to start reducing your risk of all cause mortality by a significant amount. And we're talking like almost 50%, if not a little bit more than that. It's pretty wild. And that's again from just walking around, which I would consider, if you're deliberately trying to increase it or like regulate it for your health and for weight loss, probably closer to activity rather than non-activity. But me and Max are going to fight about that later. Don't worry about it. The best man will win.
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting discussion. I think that was well said. I think people just really panic a lot about how much they feel they need to do. So I would add to that as well. It does depend on where the individual is in terms of their fitness levels. So this is a really important context for someone who might be listening to this who hasn't really gotten into the gym much at all yet, or you work an office job and maybe you don't live in a metropolis where you can walk a lot, or you're in a suburban area where you're driving all the time. People around the nation like really don't walk, but we live in New York, so we're used to 8, 10, 12,000 steps, at least for me, being a trainer, just running around the city. You can get a lot of steps in a day just walking around. Often people like, we have delis and stuff. That's great. You just walk to the deli, walk to the grocery store. That's literally a blessing. It's why I feel you don't see as many people who are carrying excess adiposity or a little overweight more as much in the city as you would in a place where you're not encouraged to have that physical activity. So I do think one of the other reasons we see that as well is because there's, on the one end, it increases your caloric burn throughout the day, right? Just walking more. So the likelihood you're going to accumulate a calorie surplus and gain fat over time is probably lesser. And on the other end, I would also be interested to see, because we're just walking, right? The counter argument here is, well, what about those studies that say that VO2 max is a really good associative thing for longevity? So wouldn't VO2 max, for those who don't know, is basically your body's ability to utilize oxygen. So for every breath you take in and exhale, how much of that exhalation is still oxygen and how much of it is not? So how much can actually get into the circulatory system and be used for cell function? That is a unique benefit that you get from more high intensity cardio. So I think the discussion here on the one end is, are we seeing a lower risk factor because on average, more expenditure leads to lower body weights, which leads to lower chances of cancer and other things? Or if we want to kind of magnify that, what about that higher VO2 max being a correlate for longevity in terms of living a long life? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think this is a great example in which understanding the relationship between correlation and causation is really useful when you're trying to kind of navigate your way through many of these arguments. So, when you say VO2 max is correlated with better health outcomes, that doesn't necessarily mean that people with or people like that increase their VO2 max are going to see a reduction in all cause mortality. It just means that people who already have a low risk of all cause mortality tend to already have higher VO2 maxes. So a marathon runner is for sure going to have less of a chance of developing cardiovascular disease, bearing like any like congenital diseases that they may have or like family history, which that's unfortunate, but it's the case sometimes.
Yeah.
Than someone who just like sits on their ass all day and doesn't do anything. But that is kind of a byproduct of their physical fitness rather than VO2 max being a driver of health, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's helpful. I think that's a really important concept to highlight for anyone listening to this who has heard X is correlative to Y, or like the classic thing I think we're taught in exercise science is like, well, summertime is correlated with increased murders in the prison, but it's like, no, it's because as the heat rises, people get more angry and then they have, higher propensity to want to be violent. Or maybe the actual specific example we were taught in school was like ice cream cone sales are correlated with like
Shark
murders.
attacks. I think it's shark
Yeah,
attacks.
like something like that, right? Like, so that's one side of the equation. And the other thing that Diego's alluding to also is that inverse correlation, or just that kind of, it goes both ways, right? So is it a result of it, or is it the effect of it, or is it the kind of the thing that's actually driving it in the first place? Is it the cause
Mm-hmm.
or the effect per se?
Mm-hmm.
Is the cause of longevity you doing cardio and having a better cardiovascular system to promote longevity? Or is it the fact that those who are already there, it's survivorship bias and they just so happen to have a higher VO2? I think that's something to consider. I do think there is something to be said about, not taking a super heavy lift centric approach here. Like, if you increase your cardio, it's probably good for your health, right? Like, but looks like Diego's raising his finger. So go ahead. Do you have a counter to that?
Yeah, it's not a counter. It's more so just like kind of elaborating on what we're talking about.
Mhm.
So, resistance training, right? Like conventional resistance training that has moderate to, higher volumes. We're not talking like, unfortunately, again, I keep shitting on my powerlifters and I feel so bad about that. But powerlifting isn't a cardiovascularly demanding exercise, so it doesn't necessarily apply to this. If you're doing, like, for example, like a peaking workout in which you're doing like singles and maybe like 3 back downs and you're done. But for most resistance training modalities, it seems to kind of meet the threshold at which it actually is promoting cardiovascular adaptations to some extent. Obviously, again, it's not promoting like mitochondrial generation and like higher capillary density, which is like something that you see in like super elite runners that are doing like crazy, like, I don't know, like, I don't know anything about running actually. 5K, I don't even know what that means. I've never done one.
I know
But
18K. That's the only thing I know. Just gold carrots out here, baby. That's all I know.
of course you're gonna
Oy
drop that.
vey.
That's oh yeah, that's
Shout out my
so
kids
max.
listening to this. My Crown Heights boys.
But yeah, basically lifting to a moderate to, I guess, vigorous level of physical activity, that actually can count as cardiovascular training, because it does reach kind of that threshold of intensity where it actually is eliciting cardiovascular adaptations to some extent. So even resistance training can be included in that physical activity for just like regular health. When we're talking about just reducing your chances of dying all around, some resistance training is better than nothing, and some physical activity, even if it's walking, is better than nothing. And I think that's a good topic that we can kind of delve into a little bit more if you want to take it from there.
Yeah, so this has been a recent discussion in fitness. For those of you who are listening, we'll kind of dip into two worlds here, and I want to make sure that the viewer who isn't necessarily a fitness freak can understand this, because Diego and I follow a lot of similar sources of information from like fitness producers, but we want this to be a place where you guys can come to and just like not have any other reference points. So there's been certain fitness people who have claimed that there's studies that have been released that high rep squatting is equally as effective as cardio. I don't know if you saw this from Menno Henselman's.
Mm-hmm.
This was
Mm-hmm.
a study that was somewhat challenged by a large proportion of the fitness community because of the magnitude of effect seen and the population that it was seen upon. So basically what happened in this study, I might mess this up a little bit, but from my understanding, it was they took a cohort of powerlifters and had them doing much higher repetition squats. So for those who don't know, powerlifters are people who do squat, bench, and deadlift, typically in 1 to 5 reps, maybe 3 to 6 reps, just heavier lifting. Think about the traditional heavy lifter. What they saw in the study is they took this cohort and had them doing reps of 20 or 30, and obviously being someone who's unconditioned and going to do reps of 20, 30, you are going to get a much higher demand from your cardiovascular system. So that cohort saw some effect in terms of improving their cardio. I believe they were measuring some outcome. I don't know if it was a longitudinal study or not, but I believe it was a little bit more acute. So what's important to look at if you're asking yourself, how is this going to improve my fitness, is you want to look for things that are known as limiting factors. So what is the thing during this bout of exercise that's making it so I can no longer continue performing it? Whether that's you're lifting weights and you just reach failure, or you're running and you gas out, those are going to be two different types of systems. So I think on the one hand, resistance training, you will have a certain level of cardiovascular demand during the set to be able to sustain that type of repetition, right? If you think about it in terms of work to rest ratios, often what we see is in traditional cardiovascular training, it's a little bit more rhythmic. It's something you can do for prolonged bouts of time without needing necessarily to stop. So there's a lot of different types of cardio. We could talk about high intensity interval training, moderate intensity, or low intensity. Those are kind of the overall arcing ones, but you could think about it as more big spikes and then long rest, or moderate spikes, moderate rest, or lower and slower and kind of not resting per se. Cardio typically, in the traditional sense, for most endurance athletes, typically you can generate a lot of volume off of the biggest difference between cardio and resistance training is you can do it for longer bouts. So resistance training definitely can help you build a foundation. If you are someone who is new to the gym and you don't really work out already, lifting weights will definitely give you some effect for cardio. But I don't think for someone who is listening to this who already goes to the gym, just like doing more resistance training probably isn't the lever to pull to continue to see you get better at improving your VO2 max or having better cardio, right? It may be a vehicle to get you there, but it's definitely not the fastest car. The fastest car to get there is to find some way to have an implement like a skier or a bike or a rower or something that just doesn't necessitate as much load and allows you to be in a state where you can have that rhythmic, prolonged bout of movement that causes your cardiovascular system to be the limiting factor. So the reason you're unable to continue moving, if you do so wish to push it to a high intensity, would be your lungs or you're just gasping for air per se. So I think that's an important distinction to make between resistance training as a way of getting a better cardiovascular fitness versus the best vehicle to improve it. If you want to continue from there.
Yeah, and also just acknowledging the difference between doing resistance training and doing cardiovascular training for health and doing it for performance. They're very different things. And I mean, it's the same thing as like you can get a better bench press by doing push ups, technically, because you can increase the muscle mass of your pecs, and that'll translate to a bigger bench. However, if you're trying to get a bigger bench, you shouldn't just do push-ups. You should do bench press. So it's an analogous situation where when I say like resistance training can decrease your chances of cardiovascular disease, it doesn't necessarily mean that if you want to have a better cardiovascular system, you should just do resistance training. You should train for the specific task that you want to get better for. However, for the general population, because unfortunately, most of the people nowadays are sedentary. I know if you're listening to this podcast, there's a high chance that you're already kind of involved in fitness, because otherwise, like, why do you know us? And if you do know us, you know that we don't shut up about fitness, and we're going to start talking about it at some point. So you've definitely been influenced to some extent.
That's 100% true.
But for most people, like most people don't need to be worrying about whether like a chest press is optimal compared to the bench press or dumbbell press. Most people just need to start getting off their ass and going on a walk, or just need to like pick up a weight and do a workout. And you see, like I said, you see the majority of that improvement in health by just doing something, by just doing a decent amount of something, rather than just like thinking about what intensity should I go at? Like how much weight should I put on the bar? Like what progression scheme should I use? All of that comes as a byproduct of you wanting to increase your performance from
Bring your mic a
closer.
little bit closer. Sorry. Yeah. A little bit more clear when you talk closer.
Okay. I see. My bad. I start speaking with my hands, and I don't want to like slap the mic all over the place, which is why.
Yeah. No, you're good.
There we go. Okay. I have to get into podcast form.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're going to see the majority of those improvements to health from just purely doing something and doing it consistently and doing it for a decent amount of time. And that's kind of obviously like Max is talking a little bit more from like the performance side of things. I'm referring a little bit more from kind of like the public health, like medicine side of the equation, where a lot of the patients that, doctors see are patients that like don't really have access to exercise facilities, or like haven't really picked up a weight because they haven't been exposed to just how to do it. And I think people should start worrying less about knowing how to do things perfectly before doing them, and more about just doing things and then learning as you do.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point. I think that I think a good takeaway from that is stop worrying about doing the best thing and just start worrying about doing a thing and just start taking action, right? And just getting after it in any capacity. I think a sub note to this conversation that we're probably talking around here is your time availability to do exercise. So if you're somebody who is super sedentary, but you work all the time, you have two kids, you get home from work and you have to feed them, and it's 7 p.m. And then once they're done eating dinner, it's 8:30, you put them down, you're not going to the gym. Or let's say you have three resistance training sessions that you can barely squeeze in during your lunch break throughout Monday, Wednesday, Friday, right? But outside of that, maybe you don't have a lot of opportunity to get those steps in. That's just is the reality of some people that have those types of jobs. I think something to consider is if you have less time, then implementing separate cardio in which you have a more moderate or vigorous intensity can probably get you those effects of being someone who's just pretty active on a day-to-day basis a little bit more efficiently. So I think a conversation here is if you have a shitty cardiovascular system, I can't just say, hey, go get 10,000 steps if it doesn't work with your life. So, other ways to improve your cardiovascular system outside of needing to overhaul your lifestyle is finding even 20 to 30 minutes less. It could even be 10 to 15 minutes of more moderate to higher intensity interval training in which you stress your cardiovascular system in a more concerted time frame and just push it. And that'll give you an effect that could be similar to someone who just does 10,000 steps, right? So I think seeing this as two sides of the spectrum here, not everybody has all the time in the world to increase that step count. While it's definitely beneficial, as Diego alluded to, right? That 5 to 10,000 steps. I've seen studies that say like 7 to 16,000 steps. Like there can be a pretty steady incline. Obviously, it drops off. There's diminishing returns, but you could still see improvements up to 16,000 steps. While that difference from 12 to 16 might not be as much as 6 to 10, obviously, you still do see some improvements. But for those who are listening to this, we're like, well, that's not useful. I need to be able to get my improvement in health elsewhere, in another way. You can do something. This is a little bit of a digression, but kind of another sub point here. Interesting research over the past couple of years has elucidated or just brought to light something called an exercise snack, which basically just means really short bouts of exercise that you can just incorporate in your day to day that jack your heart rate up, demand a lot from your body. In literally 30 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes. Like it doesn't have to be a long period of time. Think about people, you could just set habits of like every 2 hours for about 2 minutes, I'm going to do burpees, right? Or I'm going to run up the stairs for 2 minutes during COVID. Like, remember those times when like you're going crazy if you ever stuck at home, you just like inherently have to do these things. You have the zoomies. My mom was so crazy with the zoomies in COVID. It was hilarious. We have videos of my mom running in the apartment hallway, just doing laps. Being in COVID in New York City was the craziest thing. But you feel this
Dude,
need to
I
burn.
was like hanging from stairs, like doing pull-ups because I was
Yeah,
just like, I have to do
exactly.
something, you know?
You have to do something, especially if you're into fitness. Your body has a need to burn, to expend, right? So I just wanted to add that sub point as 100% Diego's right on the mark with the overall health for most people. Moving more is going to be your best friend. It is going to be the way that's probably the most easy to maintain, the most easy to implement just in a long-term way. The most consistent thing you can do is just look to move more. But if you're listening to this and you want something more efficient, increasing that moderate to vigor intensity and doing a little bit less of it is probably also a really good option.
That very well is reflected in the ACSE physical activity guidelines, where it's like 150 minutes of low intensity to moderate intensity physical activity, or 75 minutes of moderate to high intensity physical activity. So, like, if you can't do a lot, then do as much as you can and maybe jack up the intensity a little bit. But again, something is better than nothing. As long as you're not sitting down and you're not just like, being a couch potato all day, then it's probably going to lend itself to some pretty substantial health benefits. So don't get frozen up by paralysis by analysis on like, oh, well, I don't have access to like a super high quality gym facility. Like I can't get in like the like periodized programming that I would like to do. If you're in a time crunch or life just isn't permitting it right now, doing something is better than doing nothing. Same goes for a lot of, I have a couple of clients right now that are having trouble squeezing in resistance training sessions because they're like in crunch time during school, or they're like working a side job and they can't really like manage both super well while throwing in sessions in there. What we'll try to do is just these sessions that we do, just do a bunch of supersets. Like we don't obviously like that isn't like the best for hypertrophy. Ideally, we would have them do like straight sets where they can just go really hard, but it's still great. It's still better than nothing, and it's still going to cause hypertrophic adaptations. So just finding ways to squeeze in physical activity in there is a great idea. If that's steps, if that's like Max said, doing like burpees every now and again, even though everyone in the office is going to look at you and they're going to laugh at you. I'm kidding. They're not going to do that. They're probably going to
They can
join
go
you
fuck
and they're going to start
themselves
doing
respectfully.
exactly.
Yeah.
They're going to start doing burpees with you. They're going to look at your abs. They're going to be like, oh my God, this
Ugh.
guy is shredded. He's jacked, stacked,
Shredded from
juicy.
burpees. Just
He's
ice.
a Greek god. He or she is a Greek goddess.
Correct.
Everyone can be jacked nowadays.
Yeah.
But yeah, just do something. Really, just do something. If you're a more advanced lifter, obviously this conversation might not apply to you, but it also might. If you're way too focused in your ways and you need to start increasing your physical activity because you either want to like burn fat or you want to be more cardiovascularly fit, just start doing something on the side.
Mhm.
You like if it's like going on a walk, if it's like a 10-minute like assault bike workout or something like that can pay dividends down the line.
Yeah. Just to briefly wrap up this topic, because I think we've done a really good job of walking through a lot of it. The ACSM guidelines, as Diego alluded to here, either roughly 3 to 5 days per week, you want to see some type of aerobic activity is what they say, but it doesn't matter. If you think about it on a weekly time scale, getting around 150 to 300 minutes per week of moderate intensity, low to moderate, or vigorous in that 75 to 150 minutes per week. So that's kind of what it says here when I just looked that up, I believe. So ChatGPT said, but I might be wrong. It's always a liar.
Wait, no, it's not. It's not ACSM. It's literally the CDC. The CDC
Oh,
gives
it's the
those
CDC
recommendations.
guidelines.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's a CDC for Americans. So,
Interesting.
and
Okay,
those
cool.
are the ones that you'll hear. Like for example, like as a medical practitioner, those are like the physical activity guidelines I have to recommend my patients.
Right. So, key takeaways from this segment, I would probably suggest, as we just said, make sure you're moving. Steps are a really great way to start by getting your body healthier and by creating a bigger baseline expenditure of calories on a day-to-day basis. Rather than worrying about ripping the gym a few times a week hard and setting on the treadmill, you might find you're better off just trying to take more walks and create habits around those things. So make sure you're doing more, just generally speaking. And as Diego said, that will help with your health as well as burning more calories and just being able to maintain a lower body weight, which probably will lead to also improved health outcomes. Yeah. Anything else you want to add to that?
I mean, as much as we've kind of talked about this from a health perspective, this also applies to you if you're trying to lose weight, like actively trying to lose weight for aesthetic reasons rather than health reasons, which, a lot of fitness oriented people are trying to do. Same applies to you, like don't necessarily try to like up your physical activity from like doing 5,000 steps per week to trying to do like cardio 4 times per week. You can very easily just up your
Mm-hmm.
step count a little bit and just progressively do that. And that's, again, going to positively impact your energy expenditure to the point where you can enter a calorie deficit and lose weight. Um,
Mm-hmm.
the guidelines aren't going to be necessarily the same if you're trying to lose weight or you're trying to better your health by using cardiovascular training through physical activity. But um, but it's very similar in the sense where like don't try to do the perfect thing. Don't try to like go over the top and think that you have to do everything to get better. Like start with a little bit, as much as you can fit in, or not even as much as you can fit in, just a little bit more than you're already doing. And then progress from there if you can, or find, like Max was talking about, kind of intelligent ways to fit this in here and there if your schedule is really packed. And
Mm-hmm.
that's going to be much more conducive towards your goals if they are health oriented or aesthetically oriented than just like doing way too much and then burning out and not continuing to do it. Because at the end of the day, what matters is the consistency and like the volume of exercise that you're able to fit in over time, over days, weeks, months.
100%. I think it's a really good point to kind of add to that. I want to kind of do maybe a quick follow-up point to this, because as you speak, one more thing kind of pops into my head. And this is for people who do traditional cardio with the idea of burning fat. So there's a really big difference between burning fat and losing fat. And this is something that I see is commonly misunderstood by a lot of people, even other trainers I know. Think about doing cardio as the way to literally get the fat off of their body. If you've ever seen a cardio machine, for instance, you walk up to it, it'll have certain things on it that are called cardio fat burning zones, right? It leads you to believe that 300 calories on an elliptical means that you're going to enter a 300 calorie deficit. But what's important to understand is burning fat isn't the same as losing fat. So you could go onto a cardio machine, burn 300 calories, let's say what it says on the machine. It isn't always accurate, but let's say you put your weight in it, you're on the elliptical for 45 minutes, you burn 300 calories. There's a couple different perspectives here, but what's important is that won't necessarily mean that you have a 300 calorie deficit on the day. There can be a lot of things that happen downstream from that bout of cardio that can influence your ability to have that net loss maintain 300. So without getting too sciencey, the scientific idea behind this is called the constrained energy model of just a constrained energy model. So essentially just means your body's smart and can sense when it's losing fat or just any tissue where it's losing body weight per se. It'll have other compensatory mechanisms or other things that kind of switch or change to try to compensate for that loss that you have on the cardio machine. So what that means is if you do 300 calories on the elliptical, your body's probably going to slow down in other processes that you might not even realize throughout the rest of your day. You might twiddle your thumbs less. You might get up less to go do the dishes. You might walk less. You might dance less. You might laugh less. Your body is super smart and your metabolism is really reactive, especially if you're someone who is already not super overweight and you are in an attempt to lose fat. What's really important, I just think generally speaking, be cautious when people say the phrase burn fat. Imagine you save money all month and then go spend 10 G's on, the 31st. You could do that, or you could just evenly spread out that cash spending throughout the month. Both are going to have the same impact on your bank account. Same idea as like burning those calories in the beginning of the day. You might just make up for it later in the day by not moving as much. So just think of your overall expenditure from a broader lens and understand the body is smart. This does not mean that you shouldn't do cardio and that it won't have some effect on that fat loss. So I believe depending on how lean you are, some studies have shown like 70 to 80% of the calories burned via that quote unquote 300 calorie burn, or just if you're doing exercise on a cardio machine to burn calories, you could probably say, depending on your leanness, once again, probably 70% of that can be added to your net loss. But there's still that 30% compensatory mechanism that your body will try to slow down other processes to, make up for. So maybe 200 calories of it is actually end up being burned at the end of the day. So don't go do cardio and then go eat that bagel that equates to what you see on the elliptical, because that's not how the body works. First of all, the machine's inaccurate. And second of all, you're going to already slow down in other ways of your life. So I just wanted to add that as a second kind of topic.
I think that topic in and of itself could be an entire podcast where we can kind of discuss like the processes by which this compensatory mechanism occurs and like ways to kind of try to avoid that, because you can't really avoid that. Like when you're losing weight, your body is going to adapt to that weight loss because we literally have evolved from years and years and like centuries of starvation, and we're like in an age right now where we actually have like a surplus of food for the first time. So I think that's a great point, and if you guys are interested, we can definitely do an entire podcast to talk about that, both from like a just shooting the shit talking about science perspective, but also like how that can be applicable towards your fat loss goals. So
Yeah.
yeah, great point. I love that.
Yeah.
That was great.
I think that this podcast is going to be just a pretty much mostly physical activity. I think we could delve into other topics on other podcasts for sure, but we've definitely gone into this to a certain level of depth where I think we could keep it around this. Go ahead.
And I think you can now understand from this podcast why we have to reel it back sometimes and not go so into the science. Because
Yeah.
like that's the beauty of science. It's like you can take one topic and come at it from like a million different perspectives based on like who you're recommending it to and like what the conditions are that you're trying to like measure. So like when I'm, for example, talking about BCAAs and I'm like saying, well, they're helpful. And then I say, well, they're kind of not helpful. That's because it's like for different people, different circumstances, like different ways that you're tackling it. And that level of nuance is something that's kind of the reason why we're doing this podcast in the first place, so that we can go into that level of nuance. Because like you can't create that through an Instagram caption. It doesn't happen as readily.
100%. I love that. I think that there's so many levels of granularity you can get into this, and bear with us as we try to triangulate and get better at understanding how magnified we want to become, because Diego and I probably just need to have an outline, I guess, of how deep we want to get with some of these topics a bit more rigidly. But these kind of topics we know a lot about, so we want to share different things that come up for us when we hear it. Right? We have certain things that are relatable to us that we feel could help you, the viewer or the listener, to actually benefit from. So this is where you guys can step in and be like, hey, I really appreciate that level of granularity, or let's keep it more, surface level and just have more topics. I do think as we have more high volume of podcasts, we'll have the opportunity to talk for longer, and expect that, right? So it's a good opportunity for us to kind of get into the weeds with it a little bit. And yeah, we could talk about these topics forever, but just like one more note on the fat loss thing. I think that really could be its whole own podcast. So if you guys are interested in doing kind of like maybe a debunking for traditional fat loss things, we could really just make a good podcast on that alone. So
We can tear shit up if we want to. Don't worry about that. So just, if you have any questions or like any kind of, I don't know, I guess like traditional fat loss myths that you would like to see either proved or disprove, just shoot it our way and
yeah,
we'll do our research.
100%. And absolutely, we're open to doing research on things that we aren't currently highly educated on. So maybe talking more about like cardio modalities, or like programming for cardio. That's not really us. Don't come to us for that podcast, but we could in
Like I
theory.
said, I'm not a marathon coach. Don't come to us for marathon advice, but cardio for the sake
But
of
you're gonna do 10 sets of leg press
but
twice a week and
okay, so
skip the
here's what you're gonna
running.
want to do. Here's what you're gonna want to do. Okay. 500 calorie deficit, right?
Yeah,
A
yeah,
bunch of
yeah.
clenbuterol. I'm kidding. It ends there.
Yes,
That's
this
not
is how you're
my
gonna
actual.
PR your marathon time at a deficit. It's ideal. It's
That is
optimized.
ideal. Yeah. So yeah, again, we're coming at this purely from a aesthetic perspective, like enhancing your aesthetics by using cardiovascular exercise for the sake of fat loss and also to improve your health. So if you're an endurance athlete, if you're an absolute freak of nature like that, and you hate yourself and you just love running for hours, I could never understand that. You're better than I am. You could probably seek another level of granularity in like the how much physical activity you need, or like what type of physical activity you need.
Yeah, I'd say better is one way to put it. Maybe just you should be psychiatrist. We just need a sit down talk. Intervention with anyone here who has done a marathon and proceeds to do more. You guys are really built
Who hurt
different.
you? Just who
Yeah.
hurt you?
What are
Like
you
really?
running from? All
Exactly.
right.
What are you running?
It's just one of these things. What are the voices in the head telling you to take that next step? Why? Let's have a sit down
Why?
conversation. Comment below. Send us your information. We'll bring you onto the podcast and we'll have an intervention with you.
I'll recommend you to whoever of my classmates turns into a psychiatrist. I'll recommend you to them. You'll be their
Exactly. We
first
have
patient
referrals
for
all
sure.
around. 100%. Is there anything else you want to comment? Do you feel like there's anything we could have talked about a little bit deeper on this that you want to add for now? Or we could probably close this one out if you're interested.
I think we went into bountiful depth, to be honest. Just one
Yeah.
thing, and this is like very quick. We're talking about like people who run being insane and like us perceiving them as being crazy. What do you think people think when they see our exertion faces when we're doing like an ARP, like we're doing like a 0 RIR set of leg press? Like,
oh my God. I remember one of the first times I worked out with my girlfriend Alexa, and just like, you just don't want them to see that. It's just something. It's just you can't hide that. That's just like the most raw side of you that you just, when it comes out, it's there. It's
primal. It's I lose control of my face muscles. Like my entire soul is within my vastus lateralis right now, pushing weight off me so I don't die. So like my face muscles just start like contorting. Also, if you guys want to see crazy exertion faces, I'm sure me and Max can like put them on the screen right now. We definitely have a highlight reel of some of our best ones.
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
do. I do at least. I have some crazy
I
ones.
have literally a favorited album of Diego, and like half the pictures are just zoomed in from videos of him doing like chest flies, and he's like smiling like he's literally about to charge into war. It's the craziest thing. They are the most insane snaps. I love them.
My eyes
You
like
have
pop
some of
out
the
of my
craziest ones.
skull. Oh
For
yeah, I
me,
do.
I just get like purple. Like my blood pressure and my skin becomes like I'm like squeezing out something that's from a different
For
planet.
sure. Yeah, you start spouting some
Anyways,
phrases too.
yeah, we get into it for sure. Anyway, I think that's a really good place to end podcast number 2. If you guys are actually here listening this long, why don't you go comment below good with at least 4 O's so we know you
Mm-hmm.
heard this. GOOOD, however many O's you
All
want to add.
caps. All caps. All
And
caps.
if
Don't
you're
fail.
really good, you can do the UH at the end of it. So good. Just on
Good.
brand. But we really, once again, we do want to thank you so much for tuning in. This was our first time doing this remotely. I think it went super well. Hopefully all this ends up being really good. But as we go podcast to podcast, we will just continue to refine this further. So make sure to show your support down below. Leave a like if you haven't already. On Apple Podcasts and Spotify Podcasts, you can leave a rating and review. So that helps us to kind of get more eyes out there. More importantly, at this point, word of mouth will be the most important thing. So if you found this podcast interesting, or even just like a timestamp, like, hey, go to 30 seconds and listen to them talk about physical activity, send that over to someone who you think might benefit from it. But once again, thank you so much for listening up to this point. Make sure you're following. Make sure you're on top of everything. We're going to be posting on the Instagram when we're uploading new podcasts as well. So you could check us out at Tissue Talks on Instagram. My personal handle is max.athletics on Instagram and at Stronger with Sanchez on Instagram as well. On YouTube is your opportunity to drop any questions for future Q&A episodes. So we will be going back through all the episodes and taking Q&A questions that we find useful. And we might do a Q&A in the next one or in the upcoming podcasts to come soon. So all that being said, thank you so much for listening to the pod. Can't wait to have you guys back for the next episode, and we'll see you in the next one.
Peace out, guys.
Later.